Okay, first of all, let me say how terrific it is to be in good company. I've done a couple of these with nobody here and just the things staring at me from the far wall. Well, and this presentation today it's been evolving. I had discovered that I had a book and I had read a long time ago, but I decided to reread it because it's written by an author that I'm sure you may or you likely haven't heard of, describing coming up in Youngstown, Ohio, my hometown. And I'll close with that one. But in the meantime, all hell has broken loose in this country over teaching about race. And I'm a historian, and I've been sickened by the tone of the discussion and the importance of what's involved here. And so as I developed this, I was going to read from both Ta-Nehisi Coates' marvelous little book, Between the World and Me, and I will, and from my Youngstown author, Dancing with Strangers by Mel Watkins. But I'm going to begin with a book that just came out by Annette Gordon-Reed on Juneteenth. And that's been all over the news as well, the whole Juneteenth celebration. And Annette Gordon-Reed, for those of you who are not historians, is one of America's most prominent historians. She hit the historical profession like a thunderclap a few years back when she wrote Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, in which she absolutely nailed the case. There just isn't any question now that Thomas Jefferson fathered several children with Sally Hemings, his slave, and his the half-sister of his beloved wife. And apparently this relationship began to develop in a personal way when Jefferson was in France as our ambassador to France. And at that time, Sally Hemings was 16. And over the years, she gave birth to a number of children that were, and now it's been shown by DNA analysis, that were all but certain that it's Thomas Jefferson's. But then she followed it up with a Pulitzer Prize-winning book on the Hemings family, which is absolutely a marvel to read. And her most recent book is this little thing. It's only about 150 pages, and it recalls her own life in Texas, where she was born, and comes up to some musings on Juneteenth and what it means. But in the passage that I'm going to read, she's talking about her actual hometown and its environments and its history. She says Montgomery County, which is in the southeast corner of Texas, in the environs of Houston, of which Conroe was the county seat during my childhood, was known for being particularly harsh for black people. Just to mention the more publicized examples, in 1885, 20 years after the Civil War, in the town of Montgomery, just 7 miles from Conroe, Bennett Jackson, a young black man, was lynched after being charged with breaking into a home and assaulting a white woman and her children. That Jackson was going to be lynched was well known ahead of time, and as it turned into a public celebration for white citizens in the area. Men, women, and children gathered and had a picnic to watch. The Houston Post reported on the spectacle, explaining that white residents wanted to send a message to black people who were considered to be acting in too forward a manner. The message was not only to blacks, but to whites, telling them what they could do to blacks without fear. This knowledge operated along a continuum from lynching down to non-lethal displays of disrespect without consequence. After the events in nearby Montgomery, Conroe was the site of another notorious incident that raised the town's profile on the question of race. In 1922, a black man, Joe Winters, was burned alive at the stake on the courthouse square after a teenage girl accused him of rape. And then in 1940, that's the year I was born. This is my lifetime from this point on. In 1940, there was the case of Texas v. White, which garnered much attention and was the subject of a Supreme Court decision. Bob White came to Livingston, the town where I was born, at the request of his mother, who wanted him to help her to pick cotton on a place that was still called the plantation. In 1936, this is 1930s, in 1936 he was accused of raping Ruby Cochran, a white woman in town. The authorities brought about 15 black men who were working in the cotton fields to have Cochran identify the man who had raped her, but she couldn't do it. And she ultimately identified White by his voice after the authorities had him speak words that she had evidently told them the assailant had said during the assault. After being arrested and put in jail, the Texas Rangers, heroes in America, took White into the woods nightly for a week, chained him to a tree, beat him severely, and threatened to kill him if he didn't confess. They prepared a statement for him to sign, though he could neither read nor write. During this initial period, he had no lawyers and was not allowed to speak to anyone. He was found guilty in the first trial and sentenced to die in the electric chair, but the case was appealed and a new trial was ordered. This time the trial was removed to Conroe because the atmosphere in Livingston was too charged. White was convicted again. The case went all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States. Writing for the court in 1941, Justice Hugo Black held that the confession, obtained by severe beatings and keeping White incommunicado, violated the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. And with that, the case went back down for retrial. And it was during the final proceedings in Conroe in June of 1941 that Dude Cochran, Ruby Cochran's husband, walked to the front of the courtroom, shot White in the back of the head, killing him instantly. He handed the gun to the prosecutor, turned himself over to the sheriff, was arrested, and was out on bond at $500 bond. His trial, held a few days later, lasted 3 hours. After the prosecutor's closing remarks, the courtroom erupted into applause and cheers. The jury deliberated for 2 minutes and returned a verdict of not guilty. And Cochran walked out of the court a free man after having murdered Bob White in an open courtroom in front of the judge, lawyers, and dozens of spectators. These events tore at the heart of the black community in Conroe and Livingston. As accustomed as they were to the atmosphere created by small-town white supremacy, these deep transgressions drove home their situation. The lynching of Joe Winters was pure terrorism, of course, a gruesome spectacle of murder to send a message. With White, the hopes that must have been raised by all the procedural moves that landed this case in the Supreme Court of the United States, which found a violation of the Constitution, only to have those hopes dashed when a man in his community decided to take the law into their own hands. It was not Cochran alone who ignored the rule of law. It was the judge, the lawyers, law enforcement, white townspeople, just as surely as the Texas Rangers did when they illegally tortured Bob White. The second passage I'm going to read is from Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. This is, again, only about 150 pages, and it's written as a letter to his son, who was 15 years old at the time when this was published back in 2015. His son is now at Howard University, where Ta-Nehisi Coates went. And he was there for 5 years, left without getting his degree, and has become a prominent journalist and writer and social and cultural critic. Ta-Nehisi went to Howard University, and he called the yard at Howard Mecca, because he met there while he was going to school blacks from all over the world, from Africa, from the Middle East, from Latin America, from the Pacific Islands, and he was astonished at the diversity of black culture and of black people. And he spent most of his time at Moreland Library, which to this day is one of the most extraordinary collections of manuscripts, writings, documents relating to black history throughout the world. And so this book is a letter to his 15-year-old son. He says, "Shortly before you were born, I was pulled over by the PG County Police," PG, Prince George, "the same police that all the D.C. poets had warned me of. They approached both sides of the car, shining their flashlights into the windows. They took my identification and returned to the squad car. I sat there in terror. By then I had added to the warnings of my teachers what I'd learned about the PG County through reporting and newspapers. And so I knew that PG County Police had killed Elmer Clay Newman and then claimed he'd rammed his own head into the wall of the jail cell. I knew that they shot Gary Hopkins and said he'd gone for an officer's gun. I knew they had beaten Freddie Coleman half blind and blamed it on a collapsing floor. I had read reports of these officers choking mechanics, shooting construction workers, slamming suspects through the glass doors of shopping malls, and I knew that they did this with great regularity, as though moved by some unseen cosmic clock. I knew that they shot at moving cars, shot at the unarmed, shot through the backs of men, and then claimed that they had been the one under fire. These shooters were investigated, exonerated, promptly returned to the streets, where, so empowered, they shot again. At that point in American history, no police department fired its guns more than that of the Prince George County. The FBI opened multiple investigations, sometimes in the same week, and the police chief was rewarded with a raise. I replayed all of this sitting there in my car, in their clutches. Better to have been shot in Baltimore. He was born and reared in Baltimore during the crack cocaine epidemic when the streets were really tough. He says, better to have been shot in Baltimore where there was justice of the streets and someone might have called the killer to account. But these officers had my body. They could do with that body whatever they pleased, and should I live to explain what they had done with it, this complaint would mean nothing. The officers returned, handed back my license, and gave no explanation for the stop. Then that September, I picked up the Washington Post, and I saw that the PG County Police had killed again. I couldn't help but think that this could have been me, and holding you, a month old by then, I knew that such loss would not be mine alone. I skimmed the headline. Their atrocities seemed so common back then. The story spread into the second day, and reading slightly closer, I saw that it was a Howard student who had been killed. I thought, perhaps I knew him, but I paid no further attention. Then on the third day, a photo appeared, and I glimpsed at it, focused on the portrait, and I saw him there. He was dressed in his formal clothes as though it were his senior prom, and frozen in the amber of his youth. His face was lean, brown, and beautiful, and across that face I saw the open, easy smile of Prince Carman Jones. When he was at school at Howard, he was very fond of a girl. He only refers to her as the girl with the dreadlocks. And her boyfriend was Prince Carman Jones. Mother was a prominent doctor. They lived in a upper class, certainly upper middle class area of Maryland. She was quite prominent. He was a born-again Christian, very friendly, highly respected by everybody, including Ta-Nehisi, who really, really enjoyed this guy. I can't remember what happened next. I think I stumbled back. I think I told your mom what I'd read. I think I called the girl with the long dreads and asked her if it could be true. I think she screamed. But what I remember for sure is what I felt: rage, and the old gravity of West Baltimore, the gravity that condemned me to the schools and the streets and the void. Prince Jones had made it through, and still they had taken him. And even though I already knew that I would never believe any account that justified this taking, I sat down and read the story. There were very few details. He had been shot by a PG County officer, not in PG County, not even in D.C., but somewhere in Northern Virginia. Prince had been driving to see his fiancée. He was killed yards from her home. The only witness to the killing was the killer. The officer claimed that Prince had tried to run him over with his Jeep, and I knew that the prosecutors would believe them. Days later, your mother and I packed you into a car, drove down to Washington, and left you with your Aunt Camilla, and we went to the service for Prince at Rankin Chapel on Howard campus, where I'd once sat amazed at the parade of activists and intellectuals, Joseph Lowry, Cornel West, Calvin Butts, who preached at that pulpit. I must have seen a great number of old friends there, though I cannot recall precisely who. What I remember is all the people who spoke of Prince's religious zeal, his abiding belief that Jesus was with him. I remember watching the president of the university stand and weep. I remember Dr. Mabel Jones, Prince's mother, speaking of her son's death as a call to move from her comfortable suburban life into activism. I heard several people ask for forgiveness for the officer who'd shot Prince Jones down. And I only vaguely recall my impression of all this, but I know that I have always felt great distance from the grieving rituals of my people, and I must have felt that powerfully then. The need to forgive the officer would not have moved me, because even then, in some inchoate form, I knew that Prince was not killed by a single officer, so much as that he was murdered by his country and all the fears that have marked it from the beginning. At this moment, the phrase police reform has come into vogue, and the actions of our publicly appointed guardians have attracted attention, presidential and pedestrian. You've read the talk of diversity, sensitivity training, body cameras. These are all fine and applicable, but they understate the task, and they allow the citizens of this country to pretend that there is a real difference between their own attitudes and those of the ones appointed to protect them. The truth is that the police reflect America in all of its will and all of its fear, and that whatever we might make of this country's criminal justice policy, it cannot be said that it has been imposed by a repressive minority. The abuses that have followed from these policies, the sprawling carceral state, the random detention of black people, the torture of suspects, these are the product of the democratic will. And so to challenge the police is to challenge the American people who send them into the ghettos, armed with the same self-generated fears that compelled the people who think they are white to flee from the cities to the dream. I'll get back to this interesting phrase, the people who think they are white, because he's dipping his finger into an explosion in American history scholarship in the last 30 years, white studies. I'll get back to that. I knew some of this even then, sitting in Rankin Chapel, even if I could not yet express it. So forgiving the killer of Prince Jones would have seemed irrelevant to me. The killer was the direct expression of this country's beliefs. I could see no higher purpose in Prince's death. I believed, and I still do, that our bodies are ourselves, that my soul is the voltage conducted through the neurons and nerves, and that my spirit is my flesh. Prince Jones was one of one, and they had destroyed his body, scorched his shoulders, ripped open his back, mangled his lung, kidney, and liver, and I sat there feeling myself a heretic, believing only in this one-shot life and the body. For the crime of destroying the body of Prince Jones, I did not believe in forgiveness. When the assembled mourners bowed their heads in prayer, I was divided from them because I believed that the void would never answer back. There were times when I imagined myself, like Prince, tracked through many jurisdictions by a man in a criminal's costume, and I was horrified because I knew what I would have done with such a man confronted me, if such a man confronted me with a gun drawn merely feet from my own family's home. "Take care of my baby," your grandmother had said, which was to say, take care of your new family. But I now knew the limits of my caring, the reach of its powers, etched by an enemy as old as Virginia. I thought of all the beautiful black people I'd seen at the Mecca, all their variation, their hair, all their languages, all the stories and geography, all the stunning humanity, and none of it could save them from the mark of plunder and the gravity of our particular world. And it occurred to me then that you could not escape, that there were awful men who'd laid plans for you, and I could not stop them. Prince Jones was the superlative of all my fears, and if he, good Christian, scion of a striving class, patron saint of the twice as good, if he could be forever bound, who then could not? Now at night, I hold you in a great fear, wide as all our American generations took me. Now I personally understood my father and the old mantra, either I can beat him or the police. He told the story earlier in the book about his father whipping him because he had squirmed away from his mom and dad and ran over to a playground unsupervised. And his father really let him have it. I understood it all. The cable wires, the extension cords, the ritual switch. Black people love their children with a kind of obsession. You're all we have, and you come to us endangered. I think we would like to kill you ourselves before seeing you killed by the streets that America's made. This is the philosophy of the disembodied, of a people who control nothing, who can protect nothing, who are made to fear not just the criminals among them, but the police, who lord over them with all the moral authority of a protection racket. It was only after you that I understood this love, and that I understood the grip of my mother's hand. She knew that the galaxy itself could kill me, and that all of me could be shattered and all of her legacy spilled upon the curb like a bum wine. And so, no one will be brought to account for this destruction, because my death would not be the fault of any human, but the fault of some unfortunate but immutable fact of race imposed upon an innocent country by the inscrutable judgment of invisible gods. The earthquake can't be subpoenaed. The typhoon will not bend under an indictment. They sent the killer of Prince Jones back to his work because he wasn't a killer at all. He was a force of nature, the helpless agent of our world's physical laws. Well, that is a controversial passage, And conservative reviewers have been going ballistic over it because he's blaming everybody as part of the problems that black Americans face. But I think it's very important, just as Annette Gordon-Reed suggested, that if we're going to understand history, we've got to understand history from various lenses. The final passage is from Mel Watkins. To us kids, this was Pepper. Everybody called Mel Watkins. I never knew until I saw the book that his name was Mel. We all called him Pepper. Pepper Watkins was a great basketball star at South High. He lived about 8 blocks from me. I lived on Rockview. He was on Woodland Avenue. And between our two homes, within easy walking distance of each other, was Ulysses S. Grant Grade School. And my first grade was in Ulysses S. Grant. And I found out when I looked up Pepper that he and I are the same age. And that's surprising to me because we all looked up to him. He was taller than all of us. And when I would play for the Little League baseball and the Little League football games, he was often a referee, even though, as it turns out, he was my age. But we all looked up to him because he was really quite a specimen when it came to sports prowess. And in Youngstown, that was important. And he says in the book that he never thought much about racial issues because he was kind of protected. He was Pepper. That's Pepper Watkins going down the street there. And then he tells this story. He says, ironically, it was indirectly through sports that the outside world and its social problems first made their first serious impression on me. The incident that triggered my awareness did not directly involve me. It centered around Al Bright, my best friend. The incident occurs in 1951 when Pepper would have been 11 and Al Bright, his friend, would have been 10. They were very, very close. I didn't know Al. He later became a professor of art at Youngstown University. As I looked him up, he just died last year, and quite a prominent artist, certainly in our area, and he's had his works exhibited in all over the United States. Anyway, Al was the only Negro on his team, the Donnell Fords. That was one of the major car retailers in Youngstown, which had won the City Little League Championship in 1951. And to celebrate, they scheduled a team picnic at the end of the season. Players and parents were invited to the event, which was held at the Southside Park, a recreational facility with picnic grounds, a ball field, and swimming pool. Al's parents could not attend, so he was picked up by one of the coaches. And when they arrived at the park, the festivities had already begun. Coaches, parents, players had gathered and set up the picnic inside the wire fence that surrounded the swimming pool. When Al tried to enter, he was stopped by one of the lifeguards. In Youngstown, despite demonstrations since the mid-40s, the mayor, Harold Smith's attempts to try to create non-segregated policy at our swimming pools had failed, and Negroes were welcome on a daily basis only at one swimming pool, the Chase Park pool. Now, that was up on the north side in Youngstown, which is kind of surprising. There were two pools. One was for whites, one was for blacks at Chase Park. And the reason it's surprising that that was the one they were allowed into was that the blacks were concentrated on the lower south side, which is where I lived, and the east side. So it was a long haul to get up to Chase Park for the black community. Anyway, that was the only one that they were allowed into every day. Some of the white pools, I knew this. I was living in Youngstown. I knew that the pools were segregated. So were the movie theaters. There was one movie theater that blacks were allowed to attend. They could attend all the others, but they had to sit up on the balcony. And this was This is not Selma. This is Youngstown, Ohio, which is the northeast corner right up near Lake Erie. I mean, you don't get any further north in Ohio than that unless you start swimming across Lake Erie. Anyway, I knew that the pools were segregated. What I didn't know, he explains in the book, that the blacks were allowed into some of the other white pools 1 day a week. I didn't know that. But what was interesting, in a passage that I don't read here, he explained that, but they could only come until such and such a time in the afternoon, then they had to leave. Because the city authorities would drain the pool and refill it for the whites the next morning. That's my Youngstown, 1951. So we're still 3 years before the Topeka case that smacked separate but equal facilities in the head. Okay. Someone on Al's Little League team had overlooked the crucial element in the city's social arrangements. The embarrassed coaches and some parents argued with park officials for a short time, but the lifeguards would not budge. The unwritten rules, they insisted, were clear. Negroes were not permitted in the pool area. The best they could do was to set up a blanket and allow Al to sit just outside the fence, so no one would object to that. Food could be brought out for him. His teammates could gather just on the other side. It would, they argued, be just as if he were there. Well, reluctantly, Al agreed. And from time to time, one or another of the players or the adults came out and sat with him for a few minutes before returning to join the others. An hour passed before a team official convinced the lifeguards that the situation just wasn't right. They should at least allow the child into the pool for a few minutes. Finally, the park supervisors relented, but there were several important stipulations. The first was that everyone else would have to get out of the water. When the area was cleared, Al was led to the pool and placed in a small rubber raft. And one lifeguard waded in and, swimming alongside the raft, took Al for one turn around the pool. Just don't touch the water, he warned. Whatever you do, don't touch the water. For an agonizing few minutes, Al was guided around the pool, 100 or so white revelers looking on in astonishment at this obviously dangerous encroachment on traditional social values. Having completed his circular journey around the perimeter of the pool, Al was escorted back outside to his assigned spot on the other side of the fence. The celebratory picnic, having lost some of its festive spirit by this time, came to a premature end shortly afterwards. An apologetic member of the coaching staff offered Al a ride home as the team packed up and prepared to leave. Al declined, and with the championship trophy in hand, he walked a mile or so back to Woodland Avenue, alone. Well, I could have chosen 1,000 examples to open consideration of the issue of race in America. We have just now been treated to something that I don't know how many of you had ever heard of Tulsa. I had. I'm a historian, though. I better have. And in Tulsa in 1921, we know that the entire black community was burned out, that the whole place was destroyed. They dropped bombs from airplanes. This was right after World War I. Dropped bombs on buildings. It's just unbelievable. But it's not unbelievable. It happened. And so I could have chosen many, many things that were much worse than this. And this last incident, compared to what happened in Texas, to many other things that we all know something about, the last incident is hardly worth mentioning, but it is worth mentioning. This was in my lifetime. Well, when Ta-Nehisi Coates refers to people who believe they were white, He's talking about what's happened in scholarship in American history, about immigrants. When the mass immigrants came here from the 1880s on until we cut them off, because so many were from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. They were Greeks, they were Slavs, they were Italians, so on. We reacted very badly to them. It might say, give us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses burning to be free, but we had all kinds of names for them when they got here. And unlike Pepper, I didn't stay at Grant School because I flunked first grade. I don't know how, but I flunked first grade. I did. I flunked first grade. And my mom and dad, in pure humiliation, pleaded with the authorities of the school to pass me on to second, which they did on condition. And it was the joke in the family ever after that the condition was that they get me the hell out of Grant School and put me in some other school. So second grade, I started at St. Joe's, which was a German Catholic parish on the near north side. I lived on the southwest corner, so every day then I had to go clear across town and up the hill toward the north side to go to St. Joe's. And when my mom was there, everybody was German. They still had masses in German. Then, of course, World War I ended that because we stopped any public use of the German language. Anyway, so I was at St. Joe's, and there weren't very many Germans anymore. I mean, I made a list of some of the students' names that I remembered. And there was Frank Geka, Eastern European. Augustin Tamburello, guess what he was? Patty Drabitsky, Polish. She was really cute. Jerry O'Connor, another dumb Irishman like me. Abalonia Pauscher, her family had just come here from Austria. P-A-U-S-C-H-E-R. So there was another Germanic kid in the class. Ralph Perico, Bill Petruzzi, Joe Soltez. I don't have no S-O-L-T-E-S-I-Z. Well, but the point is that these names really meant something to their parents. I mean, for example, St. Peter and Paul Parish was Croatian Catholic. St. Stephen's, just up the street, about 8 blocks, was Serbian Orthodox. In Europe, they hate each other. Here, by the time they got out of their grade school, they were all at Ursuline, and they were dating each other. So their identities were changed. But what's interesting is that while these divisions, these European divisions, were disappearing, what was emerging was that they were identifying as white. They're white people. And the big division in Youngstown was not between Serbs and Croats or the Irish and the Poles. It's between black and white. So I've been alarmed at the news that we're living through now when throughout the country there's a movement to make it criminal to teach about one of the most critical and important issues in American life and American history. So I hope that those forces don't win, because we had better start thinking about it, because it's indescribably important. Thank you.